Hello, friends. Today we're going to talk about the ideal set of Beethoven string quartets. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at classicstoday.com. And, I've been trying to figure out how to approach the Beethoven string quartets because, they have this mystique about them, even more than the symphonies do, especially the late quartets, and they have to be handled, I think, with a certain amount of reverence, which I'm not very good at, and also practicality, because there are so many terrific sets of Beethoven string quartets. And I decided to do first a talk about my ideal set of them because I'm sitting here with boxes and boxes of Beethoven string quartets, and I'm going to go through a lot of them at some point. We're going to do like the best overall cycle, but right now I want to get you going and put your minds at ease in this Beethoven year, what's left of it, and at least cover what I think is my ideal set of the quartets. And I'm not going to do like I did with the symphonies, having 16 different string quartets, 17 if you count the grosse Fuga, and go through that kind of a thing. It doesn't make any sense to do it that way. And the reason is because excuse me, it's because the quartets fall so naturally into three handy clumps, and that's how most of the time they've been issued discographically. You tend not to find them in single CDs or single albums. They all come coupled or recoupled. So usually you have the first six, which is Opus 18, and they're the early quartets. Then you have the middle quartets. Those are numbers 7 through 11. You get the three, what they call the Razumovsky quartets, that were written for Count Razumovsky, and which incorporate a Russian theme, including the theme of the coronation scene from Boris Godunov, which is kind of cool. But the bottom line is you've got those three, then you've got the harp quartet, and then which is number 10, and then you have the Serioso quartet, which is number 11, and which is kind of a transitional piece to the later quartets. So those are the middle quartets, and there are 5 of them. And then you have the 5 late quartets, which really, like I said, are sort of 5 and a bit, if you include the grosse Fuga, the gross fudge, the ugliest piece of music ever written, which we'll get to. And those 5 late quartets came at the end of Beethoven's life, and they also form a set of their own. So we're only going to deal with 3 clumps of quartets played by 3 different string quartets. There's no reason to do it any other way, especially because, it's not like the symphonies where you say, oh, I love X's version of the Ninth more than any other, or the Carlos Kleiber Beethoven Fifth, the one that sort of has served as a reference version, even though I'm not particularly fond of it. There's no equivalent to that in the string quartets. No one says, oh my God, no one's ever beat quartet in Opus 18, number 3. I mean, it just doesn't happen. It doesn't happen that way. So the best way to put together the ideal set of string quartets is to go clump by clump by clump. And so clump number one is the Opus 18 quartets. Now, in my opinion, the Opus 18 string quartets are actually the hardest ones to do. Everybody thinks it's the late quartets. The late quartets are this sort of supernatural, cosmic, apotheosis of sublimity. And who knows, maybe they are. I mean, it's not for me to say. But that doesn't make them difficult expressively. Expressively, they're really very straightforward pieces. They're long, and they're emotionally very complex. But they're also incredibly direct. I mean, Beethoven didn't have anything to prove by the time he got to writing his late quartets. They are totally unique, sui generis, Beethovenish. But the early quartets are much more complicated. And the reason is because when Beethoven wrote them, right around 1800, he had serious competition. The competition was Haydn, who was still writing string quartets and who really nobody ever did better than, and Mozart, of course, who was Beethoven's idol, and who was only recently dead. And Beethoven had a really difficult issue because up to that point he had largely avoided going head to head with his models. And so for these quartets, he wanted to, on the one hand, assert his own individuality, and on the other hand, show that he was as good as they were in the same media in which they were working, and so partake of a similar tradition that they were. And finally, and so in addition to trying to balance that individuality and tradition, to link his name to theirs while asserting his individuality. And then he wanted to do better than they did because he was Beethoven and he was paranoid and crazy and ambitious and all of those things. So all of these conflicting tendencies appear in Opus 18. And for that reason, I think they're very, very, very difficult to do well. It's a real balancing act. And the result of all of these sort of stresses that he faced in writing Opus 18 was that he overwrote, which is something that quartet composers often do. It really is an issue. Brahms was the worst. There's this myth that string quartets are supposed to be a dialogue between four equal people. Well, that's not really true. The best person to describe what string quartets are was Hans Keller, who was, an English pedagogue, a German refugee, an English pedagogue, a student of Schoenberg. He was completely out of his mind. He was a total whack job. He really was. And he wrote a book on the Haydn quartets, which is actually a lot of fun to read, but which also shows that he's a total whack job. But in spite of being nuts, he did have some interesting things to say. And one of the things he said about string quartets, which was an extremely astute remark, because he was talking about the Haydn quartets, was the guy who knew more about string quartets than anybody, was that a string quartet is not an ongoing dialogue between four equal participants. It is an ongoing dialogue between four potentially equal participants. In other words, it consists of solos, duos, trios, and quartets. There should always be a variety of texture. And the problem with Beethoven's Opus 18, with the Brahms quartets, with a lot of quartets that came later, is that, and even Mozart in his Prussian quartets falls into this trap, is that it's too tempting because the parts are potentially equivalent to write interesting things for all of them to do all the time. And the result is busy and overly dense and excessively fussy. And it's a real problem. Haydn never had that problem. Never. He always got the point of varying his textures. And in Mozart, in his Haydn quartets, did the same thing. Later, in the Prussian quartets, they're cello heavy because the King of Prussia was a cellist. And he wanted to, prove that he could be cello heavy. And Mozart being Mozart, a lot too many notes. Remember that from Amadeus? He wrote a lot of notes for the cello. Beethoven in his Opus 18 writes some very, very, very dense textures. Even Beethoven's late quartets aren't as dense as a lot of Opus 18 is. And so when you perform it, it requires a tremendous amount of skill in terms of balance and also rhythm and accent and keeping the energy going and keeping the music flowing and finding the tune and making sure that you can create, light and shade and variety in these works, which can seem, I think, rather monochrome if you're not careful. So, for Opus 18, I have selected, for my ideal Haydn string quartet cycle, the Juilliard Quartet on Sony. Oh, yes, they're so great. Why did I pick the Juilliard Quartet? Well, one of the interesting things about the Beethoven quartets is that no period instrument quartet has ever done a successful Beethoven quartet cycle. They are, in a sense, timeless. And you might say that if they tend to defeat the strictures of the period performance movement, then the period performance movement is just as defeated when they play Haydn and Mozart, which is sort of how I feel about them when it comes to string quartets. Of course, there are exceptions. There are marvelous period quartet versions of Haydn and Mozart quartets, which we will get to anon. So don't get me wrong. What I'm saying is that the Beethoven quartets were, in a sense, forward-looking, always. from their inception, and they got more so as they went. And the Opus 18 quartets, like I said, need to achieve that balance between looking forward and being part of a tradition. And the Juilliard quartet achieves that. They achieve it so splendidly. They achieve it by adopting a sonority which in itself is rather lean and crystalline clear, and with tremendous verve and rhythm and athleticism. They realize the energy that is Beethoven while still being respectful of the tradition, the precedent that he's coming from. And, and also the Juilliard Quartet really initiated an entirely new aesthetic in Beethoven quartet playing, a modern aesthetic, you might want to call it, which actually became the period performance movement in terms of accent and sonority and tempo and their approach to rhythm and these things. These are all things that the period instrument people basically adopted. And it was a wholly modern phenomenon. But I want to hear that aesthetic expressed on modern instruments with at least a modern degree of warmth and vibrato and cantabile in the slow movements. And the Juilliard Quartet does it as well as anybody ever has. And I also want to point out when you get these, is that when you look at, when I talk about these, you're going to wind up, if you acquire these, with 3 quartet cycles, because now everything is in boxes. Even though originally these things tended to be issued in sets of early, middle, and late, you're really going to wind up getting 3 complete sets of Beethoven quartets if you get my recommendations. And it's not a bad thing, because there's no better way to get into this music than to make comparisons between versions of very different interpretive approach. And it's a wonderful way to get to know music that has just an unbelievable amount of depth and variety and is, susceptible to numerous different interpretive approaches. So Juilliard for Opus 18. Why? Because if you're fond of the period performance movement, if you like that kind of sound, if you like that kind of aesthetic, you'll hear it here, only done better. Really better than any period performance group ever has. And the entire set is stunning. It's a marvelous set of Beethoven quartets. And this is their earlier version, by the way. I mean, they did them 3 times, 2 times, who knows? I don't know. I don't pay attention anymore. There's too much of everything out there. But this is a wonderful box. These are the 1964 to 1979, it looks like, performances. And that's a good thing, too. They took their time. It's so important, that nowadays you just get a box, they do them all in 20 minutes. It's crazy. They should take their time and grow and learn. And that's what you get with the Juilliard Quartet. So Opus 18 is Juilliard. Now we come to the middle quartets. These are the 3 Razumovsky quartets, which have an opus number. What's their opus number? It's like 50-something, right? 59? Yeah. It's opus 59, numbers 1, 2, and 3. And then you get the harp, which is opus 74, and the Serioso, which is opus 95. Now, in these quartets, we're talking about middle period Beethoven. This is the period of the 5th Symphony, the 6th Symphony, the 7th Symphony, the great middle symphonies, and the great chamber works, too, and the big piano sonatas, the Appassionata Sonata, the Moonlight Sonata, and the Archduke Piano Trio, all of these great middle period Beethoven works. This is the time when Beethoven really became Beethoven, the Beethoven we know and love. He didn't so much owe anything to anybody. They are magnificent works. They're the ones that everybody loves the most because they're not considered to be as abstruse and difficult as the late quartets, or as say, derivative as the Opus 18 quartets. They are gorgeous. And the set that I have chosen for the middle quartets, the 5 middle quartets, is, this is so great, the Quartetto Italiano. This was on Philips, now it's on Decca. It's still around. It's not hard to find. I don't know what to say about this. The opening of the first Razumovsky quartet has a cello tune. Da 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 ba da 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 ba ba da. It's just so great. It's just wonderful tune with the strings going chunk 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 chunk. It's just a simple accompaniment. It is a whole new world of expression, all in a melody. And the way these guys play it, they're a little bit slower in tempo than a lot of other groups, certainly than the Juilliard, or like the Alban Berg, which is a kind of, Viennese clone of the Juilliard. The Italiano plays, all I can say is they strike me as the absolute summation of everything that is wonderful in Western culture. To hear them play, their playing is polished, it's elegant, it's beautifully focused, it's poised, it's gorgeous in sonority, it's perfectly balanced, and it's not lacking in excitement whatsoever, but it's cultured in the best sense of the term. You listen to it and you think you are listening to the glory of everything that was Western civilization when you hear them play these quartets. They are amazing, the Quartetto Italiano. They really are. And I just think that they have a certain bigness of vision, a certain majesty and nobility even, that so suits this music. It's so perfect for this kind of music. And even in the Serioso, which is a very turbulent and angst-filled piece, there always has to be that element of intention, of overall structure, of bigness of vision. And that's what the Italiano really, really brings to the music. They really do. They're just wonderful. There are a couple ways of looking at the middle quartets. You could sort of look at them as successors to the earlier quartets, or you could see them from the point of view of the late quartets as something huge about to happen. And that's the way they do it. And I really, really, really like that approach. They are gorgeously recorded. They remind me very much, at the time I was listening to these, I was also discovering Claudio Rao's performance of the Beethoven sonatas. And they seem to me to be natural complements to each other. Because Claudio Rao's Phillips recordings of the Beethoven sonatas were also gorgeous in terms of sonority, big in terms of vision, big gestures, large in scale. They told us that there's something completely new about the music, those performances did. And that's what the Italiano does for me in the middle quartets. So, Quartetto Italiano for the middle quartets. Now, for the late quartets. Oh, the late quartets. As I said, the late quartets are actually the easiest of all of them. And I think it's just a myth to talk about how difficult they are. The reason that they were found difficult by contemporary listeners, aside from the grosse fuga, which is ugly and is supposed to be ugly and is supposed to be difficult. But again, in a way, the grosse fuga is an exemplar of all of the works because it's completely honest in what it is. It's a total, Beethoven's, it's the nakedness of expression in these quartets that people found disconcerting. In the Opus 18 quartets, there's still that almost aristocratic culture. The emotion is nicely turned, it's refined, it's stylized. But in the late quartets, Beethoven just lets it all hang out. He doesn't care. Formally and musically, they are enormously sophisticated. That's true. But that's not the part that contemporary listeners found so disconcerting. It was their length, of course, but their very directness, their lack of shame, in a sense, that makes them so daunting for some listeners, or made them so daunting for some listeners. Nobody was confronted, I think, with the force of personality that music represents. And it's that power, that force, that makes them difficult, not anything else in them. And so when you get to the late quartets, who do you pick? There are so many wonderful performances of them, including the Juilliards and the Italianos. The standard reference version in the late quartets for many of us for many years was the Wegg Quartet, led by Sándor Wegg, even though he had some iffy intonation here and there. And that was mostly for the slow movements, for the cavatina in Quartet number 13, or the Heilige Dankgesang, the Heilige Dankgesang for convalescent to the Godhead to the whatever, in the Lydian mode, and the Lydian hymn of thanks, as we call it in English. That's in the 15th quartet. These gorgeous slow movements, the variations, in the 14th quartet or the 12th quartet. The slow movements are astonishing. And for all out sort of sublimity and this singing cantabile, human warmth and humanity, the Vig Quartet was pretty hard to beat. It really was. But of course, there's also a lot more to these quartets than that. There's like fast music, and there's a lot of contrapuntal music. And great as the Vig Quartet is, my choice for the late quartets is the Talich Quartet. This used to be on Calliope, and it's now on La Dolce Volta, and it comes in this really nice box. It's packaged really beautifully. It's terrific. It's also a fabulous quartet cycle by one of the great quartets in the history of humanity, the Talich Quartet. And I really think that in the late quartets you have just about the same level of intensity and passion and expressiveness in the slow movements that you find in the Vig Quartet. But they also, I think, they're checked. They have that inimitable sense of rhythm, of pacing, of accent. They just nail the quicker music. And again, similar to the Italiano, you find that enormously cultured tone, that wonderfully cultured approach to the music, so that the expressiveness is never vulgar. It doesn't go over the top, but it's there, and it's honest and open and organic, and each work holds together so beautifully, and they make the grosse fuga sound like music. They really, really do. The struggle is there, the harshness is there, it's all there, but it has such musical purpose and direction in that performance. It's just wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. And so I really think that the Talich Quartet here on La Dolce Volta gives you an absolutely astounding view of the late quartets, and one that does them full justice, both expressively and formally, which is really important because these are long works. And if the performance is not, well held together formally, then boy, can they be boring. Oh my God, they can be so boring. Nothing dies a death like the 14th quartet, the C sharp minor quartet. If, it's got like 7 movements, Beethoven's assemblage of movements in these pieces is really extraordinary because they are, in some respects, music about music. His interest in his late music, even in things like the Ninth Symphony, was in juxtaposing rhetorical expression, that is, counterpoint, ideas such as fugues or variation movements, sectional forms, with sonata forms and an overall tonal trajectory, which is, a dramatic, focused tonal argument that proceeds in stages. And so, quartets, it's not just about letting it all hang out in the most expressive points and sobbing and heaving and whatnot. It's about managing to play the entire quartet, conceive the entire work as a whole, and having it work. And the Talich Quartet does that extraordinarily well. But then so does the Italiano and the Juilliard Quartet. And I have something like 15 or 16 other quartet boxes sitting right over here, right over there, not even counting what's in the overflow room. So we are going to go through a big stack and try and make some sense out of all of the really good ones. I don't even talk about like lousy Beethoven quartet cycles. There's no point. And I didn't keep them. I don't save them. But there's so many good ones, and we'll be talking about them too. But for now, my ideal Beethoven quartet cycle, let's get all the words in the right order, is Juilliard for Opus 18, Italiano for the middle quartets, and for the late quartets, numbers 12 through 16, and the grosse fuga, the Talich. Folks, you're not going to do any better than that. Other people will have preferences. I'm sure you'll tell me what yours are, but it's really a wonderful thing to be able to talk about performances of this level of interpretive insight and technical finish, and they are as beautiful as it gets. They are truly as beautiful as it gets. So enjoy your Beethoven quartets. Keep on listening. We will be revisiting them soon. And there are new sets coming out, too. There's the Dover Quartet's doing a new cycle on CD, which promises to be splendid. I just got Opus 18. We have to talk about those. you could spend your life just listening to this and nothing else. It's unbelievable, isn't it? Anyway, take care. Thank you for joining me.